Inside the grand throne room, a young blonde girl in a radiant red dress kneels desperately before the Emperor, begging him to acknowledge her as his lover. Behind her, another girl watches in horror, unable to help, burdened by guilt. Scarlet Armand, clinging to her last shred of hope, raises her head and pleads with His Majesty to show mercy. But in his cold eyes, she finds no salvation. With a sword pointed at her, Scarlet makes one final stand, vowing to be loved no matter the cost. Yet her words fall on deaf ears. This world, cruel and unforgiving, is the very story she once read, the personal life of a tyrant. Trapped inside the body of the doomed Scarlet, she knows the fate awaiting her death at the hands of the merciless Emperor Carlior. But Scarlet refuses to surrender. With tears and determination, she begins plotting her escape from a destiny already written. In the throne room, a blonde girl in a beautiful red dress was kneeling, kills his own brothers, and then meets the main character, falls in love and becomes very affectionate, and did not know what body she was in or who was near her. Asked who those people were. Isaac was very surprised by this circumstance. But the doctor said that this condition could be temporary, since Scarlet was dying. Then, gritting his teeth, the brother decided to simply help his sister, whom life had led to such an absurd act. Cesar looked at the exhausted and weakened Armand and told him to rest and that they would talk later. Then Scarlet looked at the boy who was kind to her and wondered if she should treat him specially. Then the girl smiled brightly and asked what was wrong. What exactly was confusing about Isaac's well-being? The boy was not happy with the girl's incomprehensible happiness and said that her dress was not appropriate for the event. To this, Scarlet, not embarrassed at all, stated that she was beautiful in every way, and so she didn't worry about anything. To this, Isar found nothing to respond, and so he was left frozen in surprise on his face. Since such a statement was beyond his understanding, upon regaining his senses, the boy remembered that he had been told that the girl had gone crazy and now believed that those rumors were true. Isaac wondered if there was anything he could, since the advisors kept the personal life of the tyrant a secret. Now in the body of Scarlet Armand, due to help Scarlet with her condition to avoid provoking her father's anger. Seeing the inquisitive look of his brother, the girl felt embarrassed, but obediently agreed to remain silent. When he unexpectedly proposed to her, however, in Scarlet's mind, she kept thinking nonstop about why Isar was behaving the way he did. Armand was not clear if his brother was really trying to be careful with his words again, and the boy himself was doing everything he could to not pay her any more attention. But his silence didn't last long. Since the Duke could no longer stand it and hit the carriage seat with his fist, the man declared loudly that the girl was an embarrassment to the family and couldn't understand why this didn't bother Scarlet. Made a face. In response to her father's yelling, since she expected him to explode sooner or later, deciding to include the actress, the girl said she was so tired of wearing fancy dresses that she put on simpler clothes and to finally divert attention from herself. Scarlet pointed at her brother, saying that yesterday he came back drunk pretending to cry. The girl didn't know how the tyrant becomes courteous desperate because she didn't want to die. Scarlet cried on the pillow in her room. The girl said she was very embarrassed by Isar because the rumors about his parties spread all over the streets. Scarlet smiled mischievously and asked if he didn't care about his family's reputation, knowing very well the answer at that moment in her head. At that moment, the girl was incredibly happy with the effect she had created because the past Scarlet didn't respond to anyone mentally stopping her laughter. The girl turned and looked at her brother to see his reaction, but to her surprise, the boy was not angry because she had snitched on him to their father, although her sister counted on it confused. Scarlet continued watching Isar, trying to understand why he remained completely calm, despite all her antics. But the angry Duke couldn't even say anything intelligible, and just continued angrily calling the girl by her name. But not wanting the conflict to escalate, the Duchess ordered everyone to calm down and behave decently. The woman stated that her behavior was not befitting of the noble Armand family, and that they should not bring shame after the death of her first wife. Trying to come up with a plan to escape, she remembered very well that she was now 20 years old and had recently died. The Duke quickly married Melia, and she brought with her Isar, whom she gave birth to during the broken previous engagement. And now Scarlet could understand this woman who felt insecure. Even though the Duke accepted her son, however, the old Scarlet, who was often punished by her stepmother, couldn't understand why she was treated so cruelly then. The girl decided to provoke Amelia's son again, and returned to the conversation about the fact that she had recently been drinking. The Duchess's eyes turned even greener with anger, which often happened if a woman couldn't handle her emotions with her whole appearance. Scarlet hinted to Amelia to keep an eye on her son, who was older than the girl, although not by much due to such unexpected pressure. The Duchess couldn't even find words to confront the distressed young Armand. Meanwhile, Scarlet threatened that Amelia didn't want to be for her the Duchess of Armand and not her mother, so it would be better for her not to give orders. Admitting her defeat, the Duchess turned her head, not wanting to continue the dialogue. Scarlet finally decided she needed to sleep a bit, as the heroine of the novel called Scarlet Armand, and for some reason she ended up in her body. Besides, Scarlet was not just the girlfriend of the tyrant emperor. Before going back to argue, and leaned against the carriage, and the girl managed to fall asleep in less than a minute, which surprised the Duke and Isar. The boy could hardly believe that this wild girl could sleep so sweetly and deeply, even though she had recently argued with everyone. But Scarlet really slept so deeply and sweetly that she didn't notice anything happening around her. But her dreams were far from being as peaceful as the girl's appearance, since she dreamed that someone was crying. Unexpectedly for her, Scarlet realized that for some reason it was her who was crying and no one came to her aid. While sitting helplessly in her place, magical clouds of black smoke suddenly began to swirl around the girl, not allowing her to escape. When the smoke wrapped around her almost completely, Scarlet woke up abruptly and fell to the floor of the carriage as she couldn't stay in the seat, angry because no one woke her up. Armand, slightly swaying after sleeping unconsciously, left the carriage. Something in this dream disturbed the girl a lot, but she couldn't understand what it was. But in the end, she absolutely deserved this place, since her character was no less wicked and envious in the novel. Armand loved His Majesty very much, decided it was just a dream and she shouldn't think about it since there was something to worry about. This was because now the girl found herself in front of Her Majesty's palace, and would soon meet her tyrant fiancé for the first time. There were guards at the entrance of the palace, and one of the guards almost immediately noticed Scarlet's silhouette in the distance as she slowly approached the entrance. The thing is that the girl was very tired while covering the distance from the carriage to the door, so she barely arrived and was not in a good mood. But as she approached security, young Armand turned to the actress and quite easily asked her to open the door to the girl's surprise. She was suddenly rejected, what made Scarlet freeze in surprise. However, the poor guard explained that he couldn't announce the girl's name. Because Her Majesty had already started the event, Scarlet realized she would have to take a detour to enter the palace, but she was ready for it. So she repeated her request upon seeing that the young Armand insisted, and was even starting to get angry. The guard gave in and let the girl Scarlet, who had never been in the palace before, and therefore offended the main character in every possible way, and then died at the hands of the Emperor, was amazed by its beauty. As soon as the girl entered, she remembered the Duke's words that the current decoration was more modest than the previous one, which made her think about how much money the tyrant had, while Scarlet searched for her fiancé to greet her. Everyone around her was looking at her and discussing the courtiers and guests, couldn't understand what had happened to the girl, and why she was dressed so simply. Scarlet looked around and realized she had made exactly the impression she wanted, to surprise everyone. The girl didn't know exactly what the Emperor was like, so she looked closer at the handsome boy with many girls around him. The unknown boy caught the girl's gaze and smiled in confusion, and she realized he wasn't a tyrant in the novel. The Emperor was described as a boy with silver hair and violet eyes, but until now, Scarlet had not seen anyone like him around. Armand was disappointed that there were so many people in the hall, and couldn't find Her Majesty walking among the crowd. The girl suddenly heard someone addressing Lady Fleda and began arguing with her about Armand's outfit. The ladies gathered in a circle and loudly declared they had heard rumors that Scarlet, as he fell in love with the heroine. Now sitting on the bed, the girl struggled to remember what happened halfway through the novel. When Scarlet had gone crazy and were now sure of it turning around, the girl saw the colorful hairstyles of the speakers and wondered what they reminded her of, while Scarlet thought the green-haired girl noticed her gaze and felt embarrassed by it, so she fell silent. Suddenly, Armand realized that in front of her were all the colors of a traffic light that didn't exist in this world, since it was the world of a novel. Upon hearing an unknown word, Fleda began to assert again that the girl was simply crazy, when suddenly she squeezed the lady's shoulder, feigning anger on her face to scare poor Fleda even more. Scarlet ordered her to stop spreading rumors if she didn't want to regret it. Armand declared that the lady was apparently crazy. Since she was talking about some unknown words in front of everyone, Lady Fleda immediately fell to her knees, scared, and Scarlet left the girl alone, realizing she was morally weak. Armand was not pleased that some girls were forcing her into a conflict as she was already nervous without them. After looking around the hall, died. Fortunately for the new Herman, she entered the novel before the beginning of the main story. Scarlet realized that for some reason all the people were trying to keep their distance, as if they were avoiding her. The girl suggested that this could be due to the notoriety she gained about a month ago. According to the novel, old Scarlet was already visiting the palace and getting to know her future boyfriend. According to the official version, the girl fell in love with the tyrant because he was very polite and courteous with her. But in fact, old Scarlet quickly realized that the Emperor was simply perfect for her as a husband, and that's why she chose him. However, the current young Armando thought that falling in love like that was crazy and very dangerous, and therefore he wasn't going to allow himself feelings for His Majesty. The girl was pulled from her thoughts by another phrase about the fact that she had gone crazy, which infuriated Scarlet with a forced smile. Slowly turned to discover who had decided to talk about her so loudly this time, and put that person in their place, when she was supposed to die, which means she had the chance to be saved. The new Scarlet, and as she turned, Scarlet saw silver hair and a noble face, as behind her was none other than the Emperor himself. Scarlet was paralyzed with astonishment, as she didn't expect to see her future boyfriend under such circumstances and in such a manner. Although the girl was confused for a moment, she quickly regained her composure and introduced herself to the Emperor, correctly in response to his bow. His Majesty didn't even blink, and it seemed as if he didn't care at all. Meanwhile, the servants were near the throne and whispered to the Emperor that the rumors about Scarlet were true and that she was really crazy. But despite this, Armando was able to organize his thoughts to resist not only the boy's beauty, but also the rumors that she herself created. Since the girl lingered in front of the Emperor's throne, he asked her what was wrong and why she hadn't come to celebrate. Scarlet remembered how in the novel, this man who kills people mercilessly became the faithful puppy of the main character. Recalling this sweet moment, the girl blushed, although this didn't correspond to the situation, so she needed to prepare urgently. Therefore, Scarlet declared in him and desperately reminded the Emperor that she was his girlfriend, a little behind her, horrified by what was happening. It was clear that under no circumstances should she behave like the old Armand and offend the Emperor's beloved, loud voice that she was amazed by His Majesty's beauty, and that she couldn't afford to walk away from him without letting anyone say a word. The girl asked if it was true that the Emperor loved unusual things that interested him, but His Majesty pretended not to care, and asked not to do anything strange, as he didn't want to see it. But the indifference on the boy's face didn't stop. The girl and she said sadly that she was very eager to surprise him. Scarlet affectionately asked the Emperor to look at the rarity she had prepared, which made the boy's expression darken, because he had already said he didn't want to. However, so that the girl wouldn't bother him anymore, he agreed to look, but only once, and Armando smiled. His Majesty said it wouldn't surprise him if Scarlet had prepared poetry, since he had already heard many of them in his life. But smiling, the girl took a glass of red wine, and claimed that the Emperor had never seen something like this before, standing almost in the middle of the hallway. Scarlet shouted that now, with the help of magic, the color of her dress would change from pink to red, and finally congratulating His Majesty on his birthday. The girl knocked over a wineglass, the Emperor, and not just him. To avoid messing up the course of the story, the girl climbed onto the dresser and took out a book in which she decided to keep track of all her affairs, was hugely surprised by such an unexpected and reckless act, and watched what was happening without taking his eyes off Scarlet. Enjoying the general shock, whispered that now an incredible scent was emanating from her. Moreover, the girl deliberately spun in place several times, demonstrating how her dress turned red. Immediately began a discontented whisper around Armand about how she dared to serve herself wine right in front of the Emperor, and His Majesty was terribly angry that someone dared to behave like this, especially his girlfriend. Was very angry because before his birthday he said that no one would congratulate him, because he didn't want any congratulations. But in fact, the boy was very worried that no one's congratulations would be sincere, and that's why he didn't want to hear them. Scarlet remembered very well that the Emperor wanted to hear congratulations, only from the main character, but she violated this moment, and the girl did this on purpose to annoy even more His Majesty and force him to rescind his engagement. For the Emperor, Armand's congratulations were truly the last straw. When one of the maids approached Scarlet, the lady asked her why it was considered that the Emperor was the wisest, since he prohibited everyone from uttering those words. The courtiers and guests immediately noticed how dark His Majesty's face had become. They were scared. Unable to tolerate the harassment any longer in this recap manhwa, the Emperor called Duke Armand as he was Scarlet's father. With his face contorted in anger, His Majesty ordered to take the girl home since she wasn't feeling well and was behaving like this. Under the gaze of the crowd, the Duke felt extremely insecure and burned with shame for his daughter. Then the man immediately grabbed Scarlet by the hand and dragged her away, as quickly as possible to avoid angering anyone else. Finally, looking at the Emperor, the girl couldn't help but notice that even angry, he was very handsome. Then Scarlet blew a kiss to His Majesty, hoping this would definitely make him break off his engagement, and although the kiss was in the air, the Emperor felt as if he had been hit hard on the head, which was unpleasant. His Majesty was completely shocked by the whole situation, as nothing like this had ever happened in his life. While all the other guests and courtiers, the woman didn't want to answer this question because she was cleaning the rooms, but she had no other choice, continued celebrating the Emperor's birthday. The carriage with the Armand family returned to their estate before they had even driven 1 kilometer. The Duke began to curse and yell at Scarlet, and the girl thought he was making too much noise, much more than her father's teachings worried her, making her think if her tricks would be enough to dissolve the marriage. The girl was distracted from her thoughts by Raising, who worriedly asked if Scarlet was drunk even though she was completely sober, but the brother couldn't calm down because the girl's wet and wine-stained dress smelled really strong, which bothered him to this. Scarlet asked if she didn't look beautiful in red because she believed that any color would suit her face. The girl tried to get closer to her brother, but he was very much against it, since he didn't like the smell at all, which made the boy cover his nose. But then the Duchess stopped the dispute between brother and sister by snapping her fan to attract everyone's attention. The woman said that when they returned to the estate, she would definitely invite an advisor to take care of Scarlet, the young girl. Armand decided to pretend he didn't understand why those methods were needed, and asked what was going on to this the Duchess. The maid said that only a few know more than His Majesty, from which Armand concluded that the Emperor is called wise. Amelia stated that due to the girl's behavior, she had no choice but to seek someone to put her brain in order, which made the girl laugh. Although she tried not to show it instead of laughing, Scarlet put on a very innocent and incomprehensible look, pretending to be sad and embarrassed. Although in reality, the girl thought this could be another way to break the engagement, but continued to make the most innocent face possible. Izar, who closely observed the girl's behavior, was surprised by the ostentatious sincerity of her actions. Realizing he could do nothing with his smart and crafty sister, the boy turned around with a deep sigh. Meanwhile, the girl cheerfully declared that she would like to be in the arms of His Majesty, dressed all in red. Izar, after hearing Scarlet, asked excitedly if he wouldn't die, to which the girl replied that she would never die, making a complete scene. The young Armand exclaimed that she had ideas similar to the Emperor, and that therefore he wouldn't look at her with his red eyes shining. Scarlet said that at every meeting, not for his intelligence, but for the lack of rivals sitting in front of her notebook. She would ask His Majesty for a lock of hair. This circumstance scared the brother a lot, and he asked why the girl needed all this, to which Scarlet replied that she would place all the collected locks under her pillow, and thus evoke happiness before the wedding. The brother was so scared by his sister's logic that he couldn't find the words to respond. Realizing it was useless to convince the girl to behave decently, Izar once again simply sighed. When the boy walked away silently and thoughtfully looking towards some corner, Scarlet worried about overacting. But then Isaac still turned to the girl and began his words with the fact that he didn't care, exactly what she thought a little later. The carriage headed to the Duchy of Armand and stopped, so the family could disembark safely and go rest at the estate. One of the knight's attendants was surprised that the Armand family returned so early, because they were expected much later. The boy quickly realized that Lady Scarlet must have gotten herself into some kind of trouble again, and approached the carriage. The girl couldn't understand how her strict family could, in the plot of the novel, send Scarlet to meet the new emperor, to help the lady and the gentleman get out, when suddenly a woman's leg appeared through the open door. Before the assistant had time to regain his senses, Scarlet jumped out of the carriage and hurried to hide in her room to avoid punishment for her behavior following the young Armand the Duchess, calmly got out of the carriage and requested to urgently summon an advisor to attend to the girl. The assistant promised to do so and then turned back to the carriage, only to find it empty. The guy turned surprised towards the CRA Amelia. Where did Mr. Iser go? Because he was supposed to go with them. The woman sighed and turned to the assistant to waste a bit of time, but to tell him what had happened. It all started with the fact that while he was still sitting in the carriage, his brother began to convince Scarlet that she would soon die if she continued to act crazy, quite rudely. The boy said he hated funerals, and his mother intervened in his dialogue so he wouldn't behave so shamelessly. However, Izar did not relent, so the Duchess ordered the carriage to stop and for her son to get out. Armand couldn't understand how one could be so cruel as to condemn their own daughter to marry a tyrant, even though the girl was reborn in Scarlet's body. And then the boy had to arrive at the estate alone. Although not a very long distance after Izar, the Duke decided to turn to Scarlet to scold him again, but she raised her hand and asked him to be quiet. The young Armand recalled that now she is His Majesty's fiancée, which means the Duke must stay away from her and not offend her, once again. With her eyes shining wildly, Scarlet easily defended herself against her father's verbal attacks, which pleased her. The next morning, when the sun was at its zenith over Carliora and the birds were singing cheerfully outside the window, Scarlet was busy. The girl, by order of her family, wrote a letter to the Emperor, apologizing for her behavior. Scarlet herself was terribly fed up with this situation, but had to listen to the Duke to avoid provoking even more anger towards herself. The girl truly hoped to get engaged as soon as possible and no longer worry about all that. Meanwhile, the young Armand had to decide the time and place of his meeting with His Majesty as required by the marriage contract. Besides, she retained Armand's memories and knew that her father was very strict with her, often going to the point where the Duke would hit his daughter. Every meeting of the couple had to be registered according to all the rules. For Scarlet, this relationship was no different from a public relationship, so she let the Emperor choose when they would meet. Armand came up with the idea of showing all his craziness with feigned modesty, and hoped the engagement would dissolve in the near future. Not wanting to go alone, the girl called her maid Lucy, and asked her to bring her the accounting book according to the plot of the novel due to her small inheritance. Scarlet humiliated the main character in every way possible, and now the girl had spent all her money, so she had to unexpectedly borrow from her parents for the lady the maid suddenly brought, and barely, audibly placed a cup of tea on the lady's table. Scarlet looked at the dining table and found that besides tea, Lucy had also brought her something tasty, then filled with joy the young Armand with a sincere smile, thanked his assistant for the food she brought. The maid was quite scared by such polite behavior towards her because it was not common at all. Upon tasting the delicious tea, Scarlet smiled she liked her assistant's fright, and even decided to continue addressing her with affection, punishing her for the slightest offense, and the girl often couldn't defend herself. Many times her father would leave her in the adult's care. So the girl, after having tea, thanked Lucy again, to which the maid shuddered suspiciously again. Lucy quickly turned on her heels towards the exit and said she had to leave, but she would come back if she needed anything. The young Armand cheerfully bid farewell to the girl once again, hoping to scare her properly with his kind behavior, but as soon as the maid disappeared behind the door, the need for a forced smile disappeared and Scarlet began to think seriously. The girl had to organize her savings, which were catastrophically less than what she needed to escape. Fortunately, Armand had read the novel and knew how to make a fortune. With a small amount in hand, which was what she was going to do, the novel said that there were abandoned lands, long ago, where magic had stopped working. But it was in this land where fairies lived, and when the main character found them, they began to bring her very good income. However, nothing prevented Scarlet from first going to these places and becoming friends with the fairies. Two in the future have the money. If the girl manages to earn the recognition of the fairies, she will be able to obtain many good resources. A red-haired girl stood up and silently covered her mouth with her hands, since she was the one to blame. Scarlet in complete darkness, forcing her to wait alone until morning, and Armand obediently stayed in his place, which was vital for her now, among other things. Armand hoped to receive the most precious stone in this world, called the Fairy Stone. The idea of how much he could earn if he sold the stone nearly made his mouth water. Therefore, Armand jumped up and ran, urgently in an unknown direction, and only told the maid he was going to the bank. Scarlet laughed cheerfully, while taking a bunch of things to put in the bank even though Lucy was against it. That same night, tired after such a hard day of work, the Emperor changed his clothes in his chambers. Very slowly, he took off his outer clothes because he was very immersed in his thoughts. Falling onto the bed, the Emperor sighed with relief. since he could finally rest peacefully without worrying about anything but for some reason. His Majesty could not simply fall asleep because for some reason all his thoughts reduced to Scarlet. The boy remembered perfectly his displeasure and disgust at the moment the girl cheerfully congratulated him on his birthday. And the face of Scarlet that shone despite the splashes of wine on and around her dress. Locked in some room, he thought about his behavior and about the Duke always in those moments. It still surprised the Emperor. His Majesty couldn't believe that this girl stood before him without a drop of fear or regret. After all, since he was little, they called him the sinister son of Carlier and avoided him. But the little Emperor did not have any choice but to swallow his resentment and pain without understanding why they avoided him. And people still feared His Majesty like fire. And he said they should be more careful with their expressions in front of him after all. Just by one of his orders. One could lose their head more easily than plucking the bud from a delicate rose. And the boy thought he knew well how others treated him. But Scarlet proved that wasn't the case as a result. The Emperor could never sleep, because the memories of Armin even made him sick. He jumped out of bed and became gloomy, recalling the kiss the girl sent him before leaving. After thinking for a bit, His Majesty realized he felt a sense of filth from Scarlet's behavior, which was unpleasant for him. However, the girl was from a noble family, so it was beneficial for the Emperor to maintain his engagement with her no matter what. When His Majesty's assistant, the girl remembered that her father would hit her at home during secular events. He always made sure, learned about Scarlet's character for the first time. He said she was wicked and ruthless. The servant was very worried whether such a ruthless girl was really fit to become Empress. But this time, His Majesty just smiled when the assistant once again called Scarlet wicked. After all, this girl bore no resemblance to someone who could be incredibly cruel. His Majesty thought Scarlet might be crazy, but not completely insane. Therefore, after thinking for a bit, the boy decided to wait and observe Armin's behavior in the future, while Scarlet quietly had breakfast after waking up the next morning. Lucy politely distracted her. The maid said a response from the palace had arrived and handed the lady an envelope with a letter. The young Armin immediately began happily printing it, as she was sure she was now free from the marriage. But instead of rejecting the engagement, the Emperor sent the girl his schedule for the whole month, which she did not expect. But Scarlet was not bothered because for her, that everything was fine for her. However, now Scarlet wrote down all her memories in a notebook, and they were far from pleasant or supportive. This letter became a reason to show something even crazier, without suspecting anything about the restless girl's plans. The Emperor sat quietly in his chair and read letters with business. Suddenly, one of the servants distracted him, while knocking at the door and asking for permission to enter. It turned out to be an advisor who had come by order of His Majesty and had some news to report. The assistant brought so many work documents that needed to be read, that the teacup on the Emperor's table wobbled at the sight of this pile of papers. The Emperor instantly felt dissatisfied, since he was already tired of dealing with the documents. And the advisor, who was Earl Clover, meanwhile, said that a lot had happened during the morning, but he would try to briefly recount them while smiling terribly. Clover said that since His Majesty had breakfast, it was time to get to work obediently picking up the first papers. His Majesty simply sighed, realizing that the advisor was right, and that it was necessary to review the documents here, to distract the Emperor and his advisor from business. Count Lumen, who was the intelligence commander, contacted His Majesty through a magic ball. The girl seriously thought about the fact that she needed to leave the Duke's family. Clover tensed immediately because such an urgent conversation with Lumen did not bode well, and in fact, the Emperor didn't even look at some of the documents brought by Clover, but instead asked the counselor to review them again. And Count Lumen, because his report was not heard, almost cried out of frustration when he heard the dialogue between the intelligence commander and the Emperor. Clover realized that the target of the intelligence this time was the Armand family. The ancestors of the Armand family were the founders of the Carliori and Risabel family, who were heroes shoulder to shoulder. And these ancestors left a legacy that even the tyrant, namely Scarlet, could not face. Therefore, now the Emperor thoroughly learned all the information from Count Lumen to be able to gather as much information as possible about the girl. But in the end, for some reason, the connection with the tearful Count was cut off, and His Majesty could not obtain any more information. Count Lumen himself fell into an even greater panic because he could no longer contact the Emperor, but his dialogue did not continue. Seeing this, the advisor realized that he was in for overtime, since the information received was not enough for His Majesty, as soon as possible, but now that opportunity didn't exist. Thoughtful Armin analyzed his entire past life. As Clover expected after thinking for a bit, the Emperor began to dictate an order, and the assistant started to listen attentively, in a tone that allowed no objections. His Majesty told the advisor to find out everything about the Armand family and Scarlet herself. Clover adjusted his glasses and silently accepted this task, as it was more or less possible for him. Therefore, the boy bowed to his master and promised to do everything in his power to obtain all the necessary information. For that, Clover asked the Emperor to share the schedule with his girlfriend, which His Majesty was a bit dissatisfied with. But the advisor quickly convinced the knight that if he had a schedule, it would be easier for him to learn something about Scarlet. Then the Emperor had to admit that the schedule had not yet been approved, but he had a desire to see the girl again. All because this young lady, despite all her efforts, did not drive His Majesty away from her but interested him. Then thinking of the girl, the Emperor even smiled slightly, which was normally not allowed, and then asked the advisor to create a schedule on his own, since he would still find out everything about Armand. This wasn't Clover's plan, but he had no right to oppose it, so he got to work. trying to figure out what to do next, but another big problem for her was her engagement to Walking through the palace halls, Clover thought about how much trouble he was in since he had a lot to learn. But what hurt the advisor the most was that remembering Scarlet made the Emperor seem happy. Clover was scared by the fact that young Armand could influence His Majesty so quickly and therefore could control even his decisions regarding the country. And the advisor couldn't allow such a turn of events under any circumstances. So he decided at all costs to find out everything about the girl in the near future. A little later, Scarlet received a letter from the advisor sent on behalf of the Emperor, inviting her to a meeting tomorrow. According to the letter, His Majesty scheduled a meeting for tomorrow and said he would arrive on foot. Scarlet was surprised by this format of the walk and hoped it contained a hint that the meeting would end soon. The girl wondered what she should do, since she had already made quite a strong impression with her red and pink dress. And if Armand did something a little weaker now, she would be mad at herself because she didn't want to lower the bar of craziness. In the end, the girl came up with a pretty wild idea. Tyrant, who caused the death of the previous Scarlet. It was supposed that the first meeting between the Tyrant and Scarlet that made her smile mischievously. Scarlet decided there was no way she was going empty-handed, so she quickly headed to the shopping street. Here the girl planned to find as quickly as possible what the Tyrant hated most: grapefruits and white flowers. Scarlet couldn't understand such peculiarities of His Majesty, because she personally liked the smell of flowers. However, the boy's similar version of the bouquets gave her a good idea of her gift, more unpleasant for him. The flower seller was a master at his craft, and quickly gathered a beautiful bouquet of white flowers. Upon parting, he, not knowing exactly why Scarlet was buying flowers, said that her beloved would definitely like them. The young Armand smiled sweetly at the seller in response, although she perfectly understood that, on the contrary, this bouquet would not be liked at all. But the girl didn't explain anything to the seller, instead quickly headed to the meeting, since she had everything ready, checking the time. Scarlet was pleased to notice she was arriving very late, which was good for her. And as she expected, the girl didn't even meet the advisor who received her at the palace door. Would literally take place 10 days later at a banquet in honor of the Emperor's birthday and for Armand. Liked her tardiness, here it was required for Scarlet to show at least a little guilt, which she didn't feel but still apologized for the sake of decency. Clover said that fortunately for the girl, the Emperor managed to finish all his business so he could accept her after this. The advisor, without explaining anything, since he was still unsatisfied, turned and led Scarlet towards His Majesty, and to the young Armand's great surprise, the meeting place was not just a palace room but a prison. Clover, apparently still mad at the girl for being late, she mockingly applauded her for guessing her location. But Scarlet immediately felt the irony in the counselor's words, and that's why she herself faked a smile in response. And so they stayed for a while, waiting for His Majesty, exchanging doubtful compliments while talking to the boy. Scarlet managed to remember that in the novel, people feared not only the Emperor, but also his counselors, because they had great power and were devoted watchers of imperial life. And some were even very important figures in His Majesty's fate. This situation would be a sign that the main story would begin, and the girl would need to urgently find something to avoid dying, as they helped choose his loved ones. And Clover was one of them. So to confuse this confident man, the girl got very close to him, and it worked. Smiling affectionately, Scarlet continued to congratulate Clover, only now with sincerity, which made the boy embarrassed at first. The advisor didn't believe what was happening, as the girl changed the subject too abruptly. But after a while, Clover realized that Scarlet was a very dangerous enemy, and sweat began to run down his face as the boy jumped as far away from her as possible. Young Armand laughed, pretending that she didn't understand what was going on, and Clover felt like he had just survived a disaster, and didn't want to turn towards the girl yet to finally finish off the counselor with her deceptive kindness. Scarlet put a handkerchief to her face to wipe off the cold sweat. Clover was even more scared, which made the girl in her head incredibly happy, because she won her mental battle. Besides, she didn't need that piece of cloth that she was now using as a scarf. The dispute between the counselor and the girl could have continued, but she couldn't help in any way completely saddened. The young blonde tried to convince His Majesty, and right now, looking at the invitation letter, Scarlet tried to remember why in the story she fell in love with His Majesty. For a long time, if the Emperor hadn't come to them at that moment, His Majesty quickly realized that Scarlet had confused the poor counselor and was very displeased with this. The girl quickly bowed, declaring that she was very happy to see the Emperor whom she had been waiting for. The knight reminded the girl that she had also kept him waiting for being late, so now they were even to try to confuse the Emperor as well. Scarlet said she was sorry, and honestly wanted to see His Majesty as soon as possible. Then the Emperor noticed that the girl was holding a basket in her hands of which he knew nothing. The boy asked what kind of basket it was, and Scarlet replied that it was a gift for him, since it wasn't good to come empty-handed. Young Armand pulled out a bouquet of white flowers from the basket and innocently asked if they weren't beautiful. Clover, who was aware of His Majesty's hatred for white flowers, immediately began to sweat. Colden went into shock, and Scarlet, not at all embarrassed, followed the bouquet with a grapefruit, which he also didn't like, and handed it to the Emperor. The girl said she had chosen the grapefruit because she didn't like herself. If Armand's life was just a commitment to a tyrant, more beautiful to please Her Majesty as much as possible, while she herself observed the Emperor's face, and was pleased to see the reflection of disgust on him, to awaken even more hatred from the master. The girl began to talk more about the grapefruit, and said that even the light mages use it without commenting on Scarlet's gifts. Her Majesty's face suddenly darkened, and she turned to the advisor. The young Armand was puzzled by the fact that the Emperor noticed that Clover seemed very tired, although this had nothing to do with it, looking at Her Majesty's face. The girl noticed that he himself looked quite pale. Meanwhile, the Emperor asked the advisor to go rest so he could be alone with the girl. And after that, the knight turned around and headed for the door of another prison. And Scarlet had no choice but to follow him as they approached the door. The boy turned to Armand and told him he would give her a tour, since that was the purpose of his meeting with her. The girl didn't understand how it was possible to choose a prison as a meeting place, but didn't dare to oppose. They walked in silence for a while. Then she wouldn't worry so much, but she would have to die when the main character appeared. And Scarlet began to feel uncomfortable about this, so she decided to turn to the Emperor for dialogue. She chose a neutral topic to avoid any rudeness after his gifts, and asked why the Lord ordered the lanterns to be turned off. But without even listening to the answer young Armand suggested. One of the girl's ideas was an ordinary escape that heroes from movies and books managed to pull off many times, but she understood that if, according to the story, her marriage to the Emperor took place, then it all made no sense. Besides, Scarlet couldn't break the engagement, because this would also lead to consequences in the form of death. Above all in this recap manhwa, the girl feared that Armand's memories about her own death would become the future of the new Scarlet. The girl herself didn't care about her family status, so she really wanted His Majesty to simply ignore her and not suddenly kill her. Suddenly, Scarlet had the idea of why not try. Forcing the Emperor to terminate the engagement, His Majesty's engagement, is sealed by a magical contract whose termination requires the death of one of the lovers or a mutual agreement to part ways. That only she could be his girlfriend, as Scarlet Armand herself, hoping the Emperor would take pity on her. So all Armand needed was for the Emperor to agree to rescind the contract, although she would still have to see him a certain number of times specified in the contract, even though she really wanted to leave. The girl understood that it was better to be submissive for now and not provoke the wrath of the ruthless Emperor. Scarlet smiled predatorily as she realized she had a good chance of dissolving her marriage. Armand froze in the middle of the room and began to laugh hysterically because she already knew how she would make the Emperor abandon her. At that moment, the assistant wanted to timidly enter the room, but heard the lady's crazy laughter and froze. The maid was very afraid that in such a state, Scarlet could harm her in some way, so she didn't dare to enter. While waiting for the young mistress to stop laughing, the maid was worried about her morals, but couldn't help at all. A few days later, delving into Scarlet's memories, the girl couldn't find the answer. As to why the deceased loved the Emperor so much, the maid had been anxiously observing her mistress. The girl lifted her head and looked him in the eyes, but she didn't see a glimmer of salvation in them. Then Scarlet did the only thing she could do, all this time remembering her laughter immediately. Noticing changes in Scarlet's mood, she asked if everything was okay. Armand turned to her assistant named Lucy, but she didn't explain anything, only weakly replied that everything was fine. Coincidentally, Lucy was Scarlet's only assistant, and therefore she did the best she could as the lady was not in the mood to argue now. She easily agreed to change her dress at the maid's suggestion, and Scarlet herself thought she would have to leave urgently to somewhere when she broke off the engagement so that her family couldn't find her. The only thing Armand didn't understand was why she was preparing for dinner already at lunchtime, but she didn't argue with Lucy yet. When the maid left, Scarlet approached the mirror and looking at herself declared that her body was very beautiful. Only after giving herself many embarrassing compliments did the girl realize that Lucy had been watching her the whole time. Scarlet was embarrassed, but before she had time to say anything, which was to lift her head proudly facing the sword that was pointed at her, desperately making one last attempt, her gaze fell on the dress the assistant had brought her. The dress was made of simple and completely ordinary fabric, and it was nothing elegant, and therefore not suitable for a banquet. Lucy offered to bring another option, since she herself realized that the pink dress didn't suit her, but Armand stopped the assistant, smiling with delight because her opportunity to play the role of a crazy Scarlet had arrived. She firmly declared that she would go to the ball in this very dress. Lucy decided to ensure once more that the lady really liked that dress because they had enough money to buy another, but Scarlet didn't want to. Armand said they could add jewelry to the dress, and she wanted people to whisper cruelly about her behind her back regarding the outfit. When Scarlet walked towards the carriage, everything turned out like this, and the girl heard absolutely all the silent mockeries of the servants. But she was okay with that. The lady knew very well that it didn't matter how she decorated this dress. It still seemed too simple for a banquet. However, Scarlet was going to tell everyone that even dressed, Armand asked the boy to love her no matter what, but this request was just an empty phrase for him. This world was part of a novel. Modestly, she would still be beautiful and wouldn't change a thing. Meanwhile, the lady asked Lucy if she was proud of the outfit, since she believed the assistant had done a perfect job within what Armand needed. The maid just sighed in response, which Scarlet enjoyed when she suddenly saw another assistant waiting for her mistress. In the street, Armand was the first to greet the maiden, scaring her even more than his suit. Soon the carriage was ready for the young lady, and she ran towards him to leave quickly. When Scarlet approached the carriage, the servants couldn't stop being surprised by her outfit choice, which caused a wide smile on the girl's face. The girl herself perfectly understood that her dress was too simple for a banquet, but ideal for her purposes. This is because from this outfit, Scarlet planned to declare her madness to everyone and thus break her engagement with the Tyrant. Armand smiled satisfied while sitting in the carriage and was glad that even in pajamas she looked very beautiful, although not elegant enough. The only thing that embarrassed the girl was the terrifying atmosphere throughout the way, called The Personal Life of a Tyrant, which the girl had read in her life when she was still alive and well, according to the story The Cruel Emperor Carlier. As the family was not pleased with her clothing, what pressured Scarlet the most was her father's gaze, who burned her mercilessly. As he was especially angry now, the girl remembered that the past Scarlet was afraid of the dukes, but the current one did not feel such feelings, and did her best to ignore him. But no matter how much Armand tried to look silently out the window, pretending not to notice anything, he suddenly called her. Luckily for the girl, it wasn't the Duke who called her, but her half-brother named Isar Armand, and he asked if everything was okay for her. When the old Scarlet took her life, only her brother found her and helped her, thus saving the current Scarlet then. Only after waking up did the girl feel a very intense pain that gradually faded away, thanks to the action of the medications. She remained still for a while, getting used to the sensations of her body, and then she heard nearby voices and turned towards the noise. The brother was in sight and spoke with the doctor, who assured that the worst of Scarlet was already over, but she still needed to be monitored. But then the girl, who had just woken up,